The accent is from Australia, in case you're wondering why I sound so sophisticated. I'm from Australia, okay? But I've been living in England for 10 years. I'm married with 3 children. They're 9, 7, and 2 years old. I was a lawyer in Australia. Don't hold that against me, okay? And then I studied at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, and then later at the University of Oxford. And I've recently published a book, The Sanity of Belief, Why Faith Makes Sense. And I've just recently finished a research master's arguing that without the existence of God, it's extremely difficult to justify our belief in human value. And as part of my job at the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics, I have the absolute pleasure and privilege of getting to talk about Jesus at universities and schools and workplaces and pubs. Of course, it has to be pubs because I'm living in England and that's where all the good conversation happens, and churches. So what I'm going to do now is begin with a story, but first I'm going to have a little sip of water, okay? Is that okay? Thank you. All right. Oh, wow. Very good. I've had too much coffee. All right, here we go. So I want to begin with a story about a pastor. Is there any pastors in the room? Any pastors' kids in the room? Yeah, there we go. Okay. So this particular pastor was doing door-to-door evangelism one day in his neighborhood when he knocks on a door of a house that he's never been to before. Now, it seemed obvious that someone was at home, but no answer came to his repeated knocks at the door. Therefore, he took out a business card from his pocket that had printed on it Revelation 3:20 on the back for just such an occasion. And he stuck it under the door. Now, when the offering was processed the following Sunday at church, he found that this card had been returned in the offering. And added to it was this cryptic message, Genesis 3, verse 10. So reaching for his Bible to check out the citation, he broke up in gales of laughter because Revelation 3:20 begins, "Behold, I stand at the door and knock." But Genesis 3, verse 10 reads, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, for I was naked." So this talk is entitled Conversations That Count. That's the short title, Conversations That Count. The really long title is Talking About Jesus with my friends, my family, my neighbors, and my colleagues without making them want to run away from me. Okay, does that sound good? That's where we're going. So there's lots of different ways to do evangelism. There's door-to-door evangelism, like the pastor in the story. There's street evangelism. There's online evangelism. There's evangelistic meetings, Billy Graham style. There's lots of ways to share your faith. But in this session, we're going to be focusing on one way of sharing your faith, which should be the most common and natural way to share one's faith, which is in the context of our everyday conversations and relationships. And by the way, often a talk on evangelism can make some Christians feel guilty because afterwards you feel like you're not doing a good enough job. So I want to say just from the start that this is not about duty or guilt or performance. That's not the motivation. God won't love you any more than he already does if you do evangelism, and he won't love you any less if you don't do evangelism. You're already completely and utterly loved. So evangelism is not about earning God's love. It's simply about sharing God's love with others. And I'm going to say that again because I think some people really need to hear that. Evangelism is not about earning God's love. It's simply about sharing God's love. So with that in mind, I want to read to you a recording or a transcript of a conversation that happened a couple of thousand years ago that was recorded in something called the Bible, in something called the Gospel of John, chapter 1. And I'll just read it to you. It starts from verse 35. So it reads, "The next day John the Baptist was there again with 2 of his disciples when he saw Jesus passing by. He said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" No, Jesus probably didn't speak like that at all. He said, What do you want?" They said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the 2 who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon, it's a nice name, Simon, and tell him, my name is Simon Edwards, in case I didn't introduce my name, okay? So he found his brother Simon, like I said, nice name, and tell him, "We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ," and he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which means, when translated, Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." "Nazareth? Can anything good come from Nazareth?" Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. Let's pray together. Lord, thank you for your word. I pray that you would minister to our hearts today. Give us loving hearts that want to share about you, and give us practical wisdom to know how and when to share about you. When, like Philip, to invite others to come and see who you really are. Amen. Okay. If I were to ask you, what do you think is the most exciting book in the Bible? What would your answer be? I want you to turn to someone near you and ask them that question. What is the most exciting book in the Bible? I'll give you 30 seconds to find out. Go. Now, I'm going to ask you for some answers, but before I do, there's always someone in the room who rather jokingly says Song of Solomon or Song of Songs. Was there anyone in your group who did that? Yes, there we go. That's it. There we go. There's always one. Yes, great. Okay, what were some answers? Genesis? John? Acts? Job? Any others? Revelation? Hebrews? Okay. What's your name, sir? Peter. Was anyone else have the same answer as Peter and have the book of Acts? Well, congratulations, you are all correct. The rest of you, I will pray for you. Because if you've read that, yes? Oh, there you go. Okay. All this is going on right now. But I'll tell you, if you read the book of Acts, if you've never done this, read it in one session. Jailbreaks, shipwrecks, riots, political assassination attempts, courtroom drama, narrow escapes. It's like the best action and adventure novel. It's got everything. Yeah, totally right. But what's the other thing we notice if we were to read the book of Acts through in one session? We would see that the early church spread really rather quickly after Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension. For example, if I was to read to you from Acts chapter 2 and chapter 5 and chapter 6, we would read sentences such as these. "And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. More and more men and women believed in the Lord, and the number of disciples increased rapidly." Hands up if you'd love to see that happening today in your culture and context. So why did Christianity spread so fast in these New Testament times where people were largely ignorant of and skeptical towards this new Christian message? Well, I think there are 3 answers. Number 1, they prayed a lot. Number 2, they took the Great Commission seriously. And number 3, which is the one I want to focus on in this session, they had a special and sophisticated evangelistic technique that we in the 21st century West have largely forgotten. Would you like to know what their special and sophisticated evangelistic technique was? Would you? Yes. The answer is found in Acts chapter 8, where it says they talked about Jesus wherever they went. That was their special and sophisticated evangelistic technique. They talked about Jesus. Now, I'm going to do a quick Bible quiz. Are you ready? Let's see which is the most biblical country in the world. All right, what countries have we, in Europe, what countries have we got here? Shout out your countries. Spain, Hungary, UK, Slovakia, Slovenia, Slovakia. Okay, yeah. Bulgaria. Pardon? Lithuania. Okay, we're going to see. Holland. Poland. Sorry. Poland. So like I said, I'm Australian. English is my second language. Okay. So, all right, we're going to find out which is the holiest country now because we're going to do a Bible quiz. Are you ready? So just shout out the answer as soon as you know the answer. Who brought Nathaniel to Jesus? Yes! Hungary! All right. It was his friend Philip. Okay. Who brought Simon Peter to Jesus? His brother, Andrew. Very good. All right. Who brought, then now we'll go outside the passage I just read. Who brought all her neighbors to Jesus? Samaritan woman of the well. Yay! Who brought his entire household, family and servants to Jesus? Philippian jailer is the one I had in mind. Very good, but there's other answers as well. Who brought all his work colleagues to Jesus? Who brought all his work colleagues to Jesus? Yeah, Matthew/Levi. Tax collectors. Also, you could have had Zacchaeus, I reckon, as well. So what do we learn about evangelism from these examples? We see that the early church the church spread rapidly because the early followers of Jesus talked about Jesus with their family and their friends and their neighbors and their colleagues. In other words, evangelism happens in everyday conversations and relationships. Evangelism is primarily about relationships. And that means that evangelism is not, as we're sometimes tempted to believe, just for a special, weird group of people called evangelists. But it's also for, or not just for pastors, or not just for missionaries, or not just for public speakers. It's for everyone because we all have family or friends or neighbors or colleagues. Now, this sounds pretty simple in theory, right? Just talking, evangelism is just talking to people we know about Jesus. But here's the question. Is it simple? Is it easy? Put up your hand if you think it's really easy, no challenge at all, to have conversations with family, friends, neighbors, and colleagues who don't go to church about Jesus. Why is that? Well, I think there's at least two challenges. The spiritual and the cultural. So spiritual, on a spiritual level, Ephesians 6 makes it clear that we are in a spiritual battle. We have to be realistic. That means people talking about Jesus is something that Satan doesn't want. In fact, Satan's biggest hope and plan for a person's life is that they would never hear the good news about Jesus. His second biggest hope and plan for a person's life is if they do hear the good news about Jesus, they will reject it. And his third biggest hope and plan for a person's life is that if they do hear the good news and accept it, that they will never, ever, ever share it with anyone else. In other words, if you are a Christian, I think Satan's biggest hope and plan for your life is that you would be a private Christian. And I think he would be more upset by a church of 10 public Christians than a church full of 10,000 private Christians. So given that's the case, that we're in a real spiritual battle, we shouldn't be at all surprised that when it comes to sharing our faith, that it won't always feel easy. There's always going to be a spiritual resistance there to overcome. But thanks be to God, it's one that we can overcome because, as you know, 1 John chapter 4, greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. So there's the spiritual resistance, but there's also a cultural challenge as well. As you know, we live in a culture in which lots of people regard belief in God or the Bible as intellectually or morally questionable, and in which lots of people regard just talking about your faith in public as socially awkward, even divisive or offensive. And all this adds up to a situation where we're made to feel that when we talk about Jesus with people who don't go to church, that we're somehow doing something wrong, something offensive, something unloving. But the most loving thing that you could do for anyone is to introduce them to Jesus. But it's very hard to introduce someone to Jesus without talking to them about Jesus. I myself grew up in a non-religious family background. So we never talked about God, I never heard about God or anything. And I remember thinking to myself as a teenager, if all life is that we're just here through some random combination of time plus matter plus chance. We'll live for 80 or 90 years if we're lucky, and then we die, and that's it, game over. Everything we've loved, everything we've achieved, everything we are just dissipates into nothingness, dust. I remember thinking to myself, that's a sad story. I wonder if it's really the true story. Because if it is the true story, it would seem to render my life meaningless. And I'm so grateful the first time I got to hear a different story, the Christian story, a story that says we're not here by accident, but we're here on purpose because somebody, God, wanted us to be here. And this God loves us. And that we're made for eternity and made for Him. And the reason that our world is so messed up is because we're out of relationship with Him. But there's a solution. There's hope, because if we can be restored back to relationship with God through His Son, Jesus Christ. And I remember thinking when I first heard this story as a teenager, if that's true, that changes everything. That's a much better story. I wonder if it really is the true story. And I'm just so grateful that I got to hear that story, because a lot of people never get to hear that story. It's easy to assume that people who are not Christians because they've rejected the gospel. But what we often fail to realize because of our cultural context is that the reason that many people who are not Christians is not because they've rejected the gospel, it's because they've never heard the gospel in the first place. And part of the joy of being a Christian is to have the privilege of getting to share that good news with other people. But again, the question is, how? How do we do that in the context of the cultural challenges? How do we talk about Jesus in a society in which Christian faith can be considered irrational or immoral, and in which just talking about your faith in public can be considered intrusive or offensive? How do we talk about Jesus with people who don't go to church without making them want to run away? Well, I believe that one of the best methods of talking about Jesus in this culturally resistant context is what we might call conversational evangelism. Conversational evangelism is a highly technical term that means, are you ready for it? What do you think conversational evangelism means? It's very technical. It means evangelism in the context of conversation. Very technical, right? So I'm Australian, so it's got to be simple. So at its heart, conversational evangelism is about talking about Jesus with people rather than at people. Talking about Jesus with people rather than at people. You see, part of the problem is we get so nervous about evangelism that when we do it, if we ever do it, we end up talking at people rather than with people. In other words, because we're so nervous, it turns into a preach rather than a conversation, which might be fine in some contexts, like street witnessing, for example, when you might only have 2 minutes to talk to someone. Well, okay, you just want to get it out. You've got 2 minutes, you want them to hear something. But here's the thing. Have you ever known a friend or a family member or a neighbor or a colleague who likes being preached at? Anyone? Anyone have a friend or a family member or a colleague who likes being preached at? Neither have I. People we know would much rather prefer a conversation. So how does conversational evangelism work? Well, it works firstly by being interested, secondly by asking, thirdly by answering, and fourthly by inviting. So firstly, conversational evangelism is about being genuinely interested in other people. Are you genuinely interested in other people? Or do you prefer plants or rocks? Well, if you prefer plants or rocks, this could be tricky for you. Okay, but if you like people, conversational evangelism, you're going to love it. Because if you're genuinely interested in other people, it means you'll want to get to know them. So how do we get to know people? How do we get to know people? Ask questions. Yes, asking questions. Through asking questions, we get to know we get to know what they're like, we get to know their story, we get to know their likes, their dislikes, their family relationships, hobbies, interests, passions, beliefs. And the good thing is, as a general rule, I'll tell you a secret, okay? Don't tell anyone. People love talking about themselves. People love talking about themselves. Are you familiar with William Wilberforce? Hands up if you know William Wilberforce. Hands up. Okay, so William Wilberforce is famous for being a great in the abolition of slavery movement in the UK. But a lesser-known fact about William Wilberforce was that he was a natural conversational evangelist. Not because he talked about Jesus at people, but because he talked about Jesus with people. And the reason he was good at talking about Jesus with people is because he was genuinely interested in other people and in getting to know their story. For example, a lady of high society in the UK once had dinner with William Wilberforce's best friend, William Pitt Jr., the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Isn't that nice for your best friend to be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom? It's nice to have friends in high places, right? So after this lady had dinner with the Prime Minister, William Wilberforce's best friend, a journalist interviewed her and asked her, what was it like having had dinner with the Prime Minister? And she said, after having had dinner with the Prime Minister, I am convinced that he is the most interesting person in the world. Well, the next week, she had dinner with William Wilberforce. And after having had dinner with William Wilberforce, the journalist interviewed her again and said, what was it like having had dinner with Wilberforce? And she said, after having had dinner with Wilberforce, I am convinced that I am the most interesting person in the world. Because that's the sort of person that Wilberforce was. People found him interesting because he was interested. And because he was interested, people liked him, respected him, opened up to him, and respected what he had to say when he shared what he had to say. Now, just think about that for a moment. How do people generally respond when you're interested in them and in finding out their story? Most people appreciate the interest and concern. And after a while, after you've been asking person stories and getting to know them, for example, what's your name again, sir? Michael. So if I'm talking, I've met you, Michael, and I'm getting to know you, I'm asking you questions. Where are you from? Slovakia. Oh, what a beautiful country. Okay, how long have you always grew up there? Tell me about your story. And I get to find out his story. What does he like doing? What is he passionate about? What's his family relationships? What's his beliefs? Etc., etc. Now let's assume that Michael is a normal person. Is that okay to assume that? Okay, let's assume that. Okay, so if Michael is a normal person, what will he eventually do in response? He'll start asking me questions about me and my story and where I'm from and what makes me tick and what am I passionate about. And when he does that, what has he given me? An opportunity to share naturally about the things that are part of my story and that are important to my story. And so when I share with Michael that I go to church and I pray about things and I believe in God, I'm a Christian, will Michael think that I am bashing him on the head with the Bible? Probably not. Hopefully, because we're just having a normal... I'm answering the questions that he's asking me. You know, conversational evangelism, it's all about being just relational and conversational. It's not rocket science, it's just relationships. Conversational evangelism also includes, secondly, the art of asking good questions. Good questions. You see, good questions can be really powerful, as Jesus himself showed many times. Can anyone think of questions that Jesus asked? Why do you call me good? Who is my mother and my brothers? Any else? Anyone else?
With the woman at the well, it's just basically a series of
They did have a lot of questions and conversations. Very good. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I want? Why are you so afraid? Who do you say I am? What do you want me to do for you? Can you see how good questions are so powerful? Because they can lead to deeper, more meaningful conversations. But sadly, many of us are pretty terrible at asking good questions. Some of our most common questions like, how's it going? How you doing? How about the weather? They're not even real questions at all. They've come to mean nothing more than, hello. Now, one of the reasons we find it so difficult to get from a superficial conversation to a conversation about Jesus is because too often our conversation is exactly that. It's just superficial. But if we only end up having superficial conversations with people, of course it's going to be very difficult to bring up conversations about our faith in Jesus, which is quite deep and meaningful, without it feeling like a real gear crunch in the conversation, right? Illustration. I remember coming back to Australia after living in China and Canada and France and England for 5 years. And then I came back to Australia 5 years later. And I go to church. I haven't been there for 5 years. And it was my first night back, first Sunday night. And standing outside the church was an apparition of beauty. Her name was Natasha. And as she was standing there in the warm summer evening of a Brisbane twilight, I had this irresistible urge within me to go up to her. And let me give you the context. I had known of her 5 years ago, but I didn't know her very well at all. She was quite a bit younger than me, but in 5 years, things had changed. So I've suddenly got this irresistible urge, this girl that I hardly know, to go up to her, put my arms around her waist, and kiss her. Now, what would have happened if I had gone up, put my arms around her waist, and kissed her, this girl that I hardly knew and who I hadn't seen for 5 years? Exactly right. She would have, whack, slapped me, and rightly so. Why would she have slapped me? Because I wouldn't have done the necessary preparation, like starting with the words, hello, how are you? How about that weather? Do you remember me? I remember you. How have you been? What have you been up to these days? Really? How interesting. Gosh, tell me more. I have so enjoyed chatting with you. Maybe we could grab a coffee sometime and chat some more. And then I'd grab another coffee, and then a dinner date, and then another dinner date, and then eventually, if I played my cards right, I might get that chance to get that first kiss. By the way, that's exactly what I did, and a wedding ring and 3 children later means it was a complete success. Thank you very much. Now, the point is, it's the same dynamic with sharing your faith. If you begin your conversation with someone with, how about that weather? And the next thing you say is, Would you like to receive Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? Don't be surprised if you receive the social equivalent of a slap in the face. Why? Because conversational evangelism is a lot like dating. You've got to put in the necessary preparation. Now, we wouldn't find it difficult to introduce Jesus into our conversations if we were in the habit of entering into meaningful conversations. And the way to enter into meaningful conversations is to ask good questions. Here's some of the examples of the sort of questions I'm talking about. What's been the best and worst part of your week? How do you like to spend your time when you're not working? What's the best piece of advice you've ever been given? Through to slightly more deeper personal questions like, who's had the most significant influence in your life? What are you truly passionate about? What helps you get through difficult times? Through to, okay, let's go to even slightly deeper, more meaningful questions, spiritual questions. Spiritual questions like, did you grow up in a religious home? What is the most frustrating thing about religion to you? Have you ever had experiences in your life that make you think there might be a God? You see, conversational evangelism, as I said, it's not rocket science, but it is relational. It's about talking with people, not at people. And if, like William Wilberforce, we're interested in other people and we take the time to ask good questions, listen to people, hear their stories, and have meaningful conversations that even go into spiritual conversations, then more likely than not, we are going to arouse curiosity in other people, and they are going to ask us questions back. Questions about what we believe and questions about why we believe what we believe, which leads us to the third aspect of conversational evangelism, which is being willing to engage with people's questions. It's not enough to merely ask thoughtful questions. We need to be willing to engage, and we need to be willing to offer thoughtful answers. For example, if someone asks us, "What do you Christians believe?" we need to be ready to respond to that question. We need to be ready to explain, for example, what we believe about God and about life and what it's for and the hope that we have and who Jesus is and what he's done. We need to be ready to explain why Christianity is good news. And we also need to be ready to share about the difference that Jesus has made in our personal lives. We need to be ready to share our testimony of what Christ has done in our life. Likewise, if someone asks us a different question, not what we believe, but why we believe what we believe, we need to be ready to respond to that question as well. As the Apostle Peter writes in 1 Peter 3:15, "But in your heart set apart Christ as Lord, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you for the reason for the hope that you have. And do this aggressively." Oh, sorry, no, what? But do this with gentleness and disrespect. No, and with respect. Okay, yeah. Indeed, one thing we quickly discover when we have conversations with people about faith is that a lot of people have questions about Christianity, often really tough questions and objections. And the question is, are we prepared for that? Are we willing to engage with often heartfelt questions and concerns and even objections that people have about Christian faith without getting defensive or upset? I don't know about you, but I think we can often feel genuinely intimidated because we feel that there are just so many different questions that people have and so many different objections. We don't know where or how to start with dealing with them all. But it does help simplify things a little bit if we recognize that of all the questions that people have in our culture today, they all fit into one of three broad categories. Either people find it difficult to believe that Christianity could possibly be true, or they find it difficult to believe that Christianity could possibly be good, or they find it difficult to believe that Christianity could possibly help in any practical way, which means that objections that people have about Christianity tend to fall into one of these three categories. That Christianity is either irrational, there is no God, irrelevant, I don't need your God, or even immoral, I don't like your God. So for example, objections within the category of irrational, irrelevant, let's go with that one. I don't need faith in God to be happy, or I don't need religion to be good. Or immoral. If your God is so good, why is there so much suffering in the world? Or isn't religion the number one cause of violence in the world? Or irrational. Science has disproved God, and anyway, religion's just a psychological crutch. Questions like that. This is where, and people have so many more questions today, and this is where the importance of offering thoughtful answers gently and respectfully comes into play, which is why the discipline of Christian apologetics is so vitally important in today's context. It's so difficult to do evangelism without some familiarization with Christian apologetics. And which is why familiarizing yourself with simple and accessible resources, for example, like this book called The Sanity of Belief, Why Faith Makes Sense by some guy called Simon Edwards. That is shameless plug, isn't it? That is terrible. But why finding books like this that can help you see how to speak to our culture with the questions that are there and answer those questions thoughtfully is so important. What's that? Yes, it is in the bookstore here at ELF. Thank you for asking. Now, you may be wondering, what? It's terrible, right? But if you write a book, you want people to read it, right? Okay, so anyway, but what you may be wondering, what happens if I read some books and I familiarize myself with some Christian apologetics, but what happens if I still get asked a question I don't know the answer to? What do you do? No, incorrect. You make up an answer, okay? You pretend you know the answer. No, absolutely right. There's nothing wrong. It's absolutely cool. It's okay. It's dobra, all right? Just to use a bit of dobra. It's cool. It's okay to say, you know what? Dobra, okay. That's what I said, Dobrashan. Yeah, that's what I said, yeah. Yeah, that's exactly. Dobra, Slovakian. You all have the gift of interpretation. I'm so glad to see this. But just to say, what did I want to say? Oh yes, if someone asks you a question that you don't know the answer to, you're absolutely right. It's okay to say, you know what? That is a great question. Affirm the question. That is a great question, but I don't know the answer to it. But I can see why you would ask that question. It's really good. I'll tell you what, I'm going to go away and I'm going to think about that question for a few days. I'm going to do some thinking. I'm going to ask a few people, and then I'm going to come back to you, hopefully with a good answer. Now, if you do that, the good news is, for all the very good questions that are out there, there are good answers to all the good questions. And if you go away and you come back with something helpful to say, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be a more meaningful and effective conversation than if you knew the answer on the spot. Why? Because the person that you're speaking to knows that you cared about them enough to take the time to answer their question. And so if you want to, yeah.
It also gives you the opportunity to bring up this question next time when you meet with them.
Yes, very good. Exactly right. because you want to meet with them again to answer the question. You definitely want to do that. And they'll go, wow, you cared about me enough. You took time for me. Wow. And if you do that, it just shows you the best way to grow in Christian apologetics. Yes, reading books is helpful and important, but the most important thing is to just talk to people about Jesus, because when you do that, they'll ask questions. That'll force you to go away and think and research and come back, and then they'll have more questions, and then you'll do some more research and thinking and come back. So you grow in your faith and understanding, and you get more confident as you go and see there are answers to the good questions, and your conversations will be so much more meaningful because they're seeing that you care. So we're now on to the fourth and final. Conversational evangelism is also about being invitational. Interested, asking, answering, and now invitational. With each person that you're in a spiritual conversation with, try and think, is there anything that you can invite them to? For example, William Wilberforce. You might have recognized, he's a bit of a hero of mine. William Wilberforce was very good at inviting people after spiritual conversations. He had a very big library of books. And whenever he had a conversation with someone, it might be on faith and science, or faith and the historical reliability of the Bible, or whatever was the subject. Afterwards, he would invite people. He'd say, would you like to read a bit more about this subject? Here, take my book. He was very purposeful and intentional. Now, today, very few of us have gigantic libraries like William Wilberforce, and very few people read books today. But there are things that we can invite people to. There are some excellent online resources like 3-minute, 5-minute answers to questions that you can show people on a YouTube clip. There are some great apologetics resources and videos. Or you could, for example, finish having a conversation with someone by inviting them to read the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John. Pick a gospel. Or you could invite them to come to your house for dinner with some other friends that are coming along from church. Would you want to join in? Or you could invite them to a Bible study. Or you could even invite them to church. Studies show that the number one reason that people come to a Christian event or church for the first time is because they were invited by a friend. Like 87% of the time, or something like that, it's because a friend invited them along. The moral of that statistic is that we should never be afraid to invite people. After all, put up your hand if you hate receiving invitations. We should never be afraid to invite people. Another great invitation to extend to someone, if you've had a meaningful conversation and you've shared deeply about what Christians believe and what Christianity is all about, if you've had quite a few meaningful conversations or a really long, deep conversation and you got to share what's Christianity about, why do Christians believe what they believe, what's the hope that we have. Another great thing that you can invite people to is to actually ask them if they would like to become a Christian. I remember giving a talk at a university, and afterwards a student came up and said she had questions. And boy, did she have some questions. Just about every tough question you could throw at Christianity, this girl had. She was really intense, right? And after about an hour of me answering questions, I realized we were the only two people left in the auditorium. So I said, okay, how about we go to the student cafeteria, get a coffee, continue the conversation in the cafeteria. So we went to the cafe, sat down, and she kept asking me question after question for another 2 hours. Eventually, after 3 hours, she said, I think you've answered all my questions. Thank you so much. And I was just about to say, you're so welcome. I hope you have a really great day. Because it had started off really intense and aggressive, but over time it had got friendly and cordial, and I didn't want it to stop being friendly and cordial. So I just wanted to say, you're really welcome, have a great day. But then I just sensed the Lord nudge me to ask her if she wanted to become a Christian. And I thought to myself, like how stupid. I teach on conversational evangelism. I teach about inviting people. I've just had a 3-hour conversation with this girl, and we've addressed every single question you could possibly imagine, and I'm just going to say, you're very welcome, have a nice day. That's it. And so I just looked at her, and I said, would you like to become a Christian? And I'm so glad that I asked her, because as soon as I asked her the question, I knew straight away what her answer would be. Because her face lit up straight away, she got tears in her eyes, and she said, yes, I would. I really, really would. The reality is that when you invite people, sometimes they will say yes. And sometimes they will say no. But if you never ask, they will never say yes. In fact, sometimes the only reason someone has never said yes to becoming a Christian, or even to just coming to church for the first time in their lives, is simply because no one has ever invited them. Let's not be afraid to invite. So there you have it, a very brief introduction to conversational evangelism, all about talking with people rather than at people, talking about Jesus with people in the context of conversation and meaningful discussion. It's not rocket science, but it is relational, and we can do it firstly by being interested in other people, secondly by asking good questions, thirdly by offering thoughtful answers, and fourthly by inviting. Interested, asking, answering, inviting.